Hi and welcome to Jessie James Beads. Today we're going to be working with pretty pastels from the Coquette Soirée collection. How gorgeous is this strand? Let's head down to the board and take a closer look. For today's video featuring Coquette Soirée, we're going to be using this absolutely glorious strand with these perfectly tied bows on rose and butterfly beads. What a beautiful strand. In addition, we'll be working with some of this gorgeous, very pastel peachy feel chain, some gorgeous glass pearls, a little bit of chain and some additional findings, either jump rings or split rings, a clasp and a small length of chain. So this is the charming bracelet we're going to create today using the Coquette Soirée collection. So let's just pop that up into the corner and we'll have a look at some of the beads that we'll be using. So we still have a whole festival of beauty to work with after we've created our design today. So lots and lots to play with still then. There are a couple of different aspects to today's project. So we're going to make a couple of little charms like so, using one of the smaller pearls and then one of the slightly larger pearls. Then we'll be making a sweetie drop charm with these utterly delightful beads. And then we'll be making a variation of that charm using some heavier wire for that central beautiful feminine piece. The first wire I'm going to work with today is a 20 gauge. I'm working with a silver colour wire today, but you could work with whichever wire you prefer. So I've just got a scrap length of about 4 inches to begin with. I'm going to start by making a really small spiral on one end. So if I just turn that around until it's almost a complete circle, and then switch over to my regular bent chain nose pliers and just draw that wire around in a circle. For the smaller of the two pearls, I will use 2 passes of wire from that start point, around once, around twice. When we've got those 2 little circuits of wire, we can just grip and turn that tail of wire away at a straight line. So the 20 gauge wire moves seamlessly through these smaller beads as well as the larger beads, and it's plenty substantial enough to act as that little bead carrier. So once you have got the bead sitting down against the small spiral, what we're going to do is bring the wire forwards like so, and then I'm going to use the smaller side of my memory wire finishing pliers to create just a simple loop. So I actually want it to be slightly larger than that. You could use step number 2 on your bail makers, or you could use your round nose pliers. However, what I'm going to do is just open this out slightly, and you'll see that you're able to get a really nice, neat, slightly pear-shaped loop just by using the small side on those memory wire finishing pliers. So let's trim at the crossover point. It's enough wire just here to make a second charm of the same size. So I'm going to strengthen that up and then just pop that to one side, and I'll make a matching one of those in a moment. For the slightly larger of the 2 glass pearls, I'm just going to make sure that that end is flush. And then again, I'm going to repeat the exact same process, but this time I'm going to go for 3 rotations of wire from that start point. So again, it's a 20 gauge wire. It's strong enough to hold the bead in position on the charm, but it's also slender enough to slide seamlessly through those beads. So we've got that coming around for a 3rd rotation from the start point. Give it a squish and a squeeze to kind of set that shape and form, and then I'm going to grip across that wire, pull that away, and then we're going to grab one of the slightly larger perfectly peach beads. Now sometimes with the pearls you just need to give them a wiggle to get them to go on, and then that one is ready to have the little shape on the back. So what I tend to do when I'm making charm bracelets, you can see at the moment I've got one spiral facing clockwise and one anti-clockwise. So I will do both in the same orientation. So the spiral is moving around clockwise on both of these now. And then for the pair on the other side of the bracelet, I will make both of them anti-clockwise. So bring that forwards and away. And again, I'm going to use the smaller side of my memory wire finishing pliers just to bring that around. But you can just open that out and draw it back in. So you've got slightly larger than the small side without having to use a different tool. And you'll see again that that's quite a pear-shaped form rather than a pure circle. So I will make a matching pair of those, one small, one large for each side of the bracelet. For the Sweetie drop charm, what I'm going to do is again work with that 20 gauge wire. I have a scrap length here of around about 6 inches. I'm just going to warm that through slightly, and around 2 inches from one end I'm going to turn just shy of a right angle bend. You may have noticed I used the box joint of my multi-step bail makers. It's just a time saver. I'm going to use step number 4 on my multi-step bail makers to create a rounded form just past that angle change. So you've got that lovely round shape. What we're going to do here is just squish it flat for a second by hand and then give that a little bit of work hardening very gently, opening and closing those pliers to ensure that that's nice and strong. Then what we're going to do is open that quite wide. So to open it up, I'm going to hold half of that round form in my pliers and just draw that forward. So you can see we've got a nice large aperture now into which we can slide that beautifully formed bead. I like to think of them as Sweetie drops. Close that back up by hand and then grip across and wrap 3 times around that core wire with the short tail. So let's have a look at that from the front. That looks lovely. So we're going to trim away any excess on the end there. And then make sure that the end sits down neatly against the core. What I'm going to do now is another simple loop. So open that up. Because this is a slightly larger charm, you can either use the larger size of your memory wire finishing pliers, or you can use your round nose pliers or the multi-step bail makers, whichever you prefer, to make a slightly larger form. The reason we're going for a slightly larger form will become apparent when we pick up the chain. So let's draw that all the way around. You can go for wrapped loops if you prefer, but today we are going to use simple loops. So trim that at the crossover point, making sure you trim the correct piece of wire. Close that up so it's nice and flat and smooth. Give it a really good strong squish. And then we can assess if we're happy with that. Yep, I like how that looks, so I'll put it in the little pile of charms up at the top there. I'll make a matching pair in a moment. For the beautiful blue ribbon, butterfly and rose bead, I'm going to use a 16 gauge wire, and I have approximately a 5-inch length here. We're going to start in much the same way, making sure that the end is nicely flush cut. I'm going to put a double spiral with a relatively small centre. So start to bring that around in a circular form. You'll notice it's not quite closed up because when I grip across, what I can do now is push that into my non-dominant hand and it will make a slightly rounder middle bit. So I'm just going to go for a double spiral in the centre here. Get that nice and strong again, even though we're using a heavier wire. And then we're going to pull that end away exactly the same way as we did with the pearl charm drops, making sure that that is nice and strong and straight. What I'm going to do now is to slide down the bead onto that core, and I like it with the bow sitting as if it was tied on a dress. What we're looking to do now is to nestle this little disc or this little spiral up into the gap at the end of that bead aperture, just between all of those beautiful roses, and that will prevent it from spinning around wildly. I quite like the idea of seeing the bow at the front. If you want it to be able to spin more freely, allow a little bit more space. Just leave that sticking out ever so slightly so that you can rotate it. I'm going to push mine up inside there so that it doesn't move around. Once you're happy with the situation that your bead is sitting, we're going to push a forwards bend And you'll see we've got plenty of wire available to make the second one if you wanted to make these as earrings. So I'm again going to use the larger side of my memory wire finishing pliers just to create a simple loop. Draw that all the way around. Now you'll see that's quite a wide angle I've gone for, and that's just because it enables me to trim the wire at the position where it will fit against that angle change. So let's take that out of the way. Then we can sit that end down into position and give it a hearty squish. You can even rotate it slightly so that it sits nestling in between those roses, and that will stop it from wiggling around too much in wear. You'll need to make a second sweetie drop charm, a second large pearl charm, and a second small pearl charm. Once you have your little production line of charms, we need to find out how to add them onto our piece of chain. Now this piece of chain is just a little bit short for my wrist because I wanted to cut the chain that I had available into 3 sections to make 2 bracelets and some matching earrings. So you can always add in some additional chain if you need to. I've got a small length of chain into which my beautiful lobster clasp fits perfectly. And you can then ultimately use your choice of closure. You can add in with rosary linking, you can use split rings or jump rings just to pop everything together. So let's find the approximate centerpiece, and what we're going to do is start in the middle with our largest of those beautiful charms. So we just need to open that up, side to side again. And instead of linking directly into the chain, you can see there are chain links in the middle here. I'm going to make this sit over the top so that what it will do is it will spin more fluidly, which is why we went for those slightly larger loops up at the top. So let's just bring that back down and close it into position. And that forms the center point of my chain. Now, there are an unequal number of gaps available, which is absolutely fine. It just means that I'm going to put the extender chain on whichever side is slightly shorter. And then in turn, I'm going to graduate outwards in size order. So we're going to do the exact same process, making sure that everything faces the same way. Allow that to link around the entirety of the chain, but it won't go out of position because it's not large enough to fit over the top of those lovely enameled stations. Exactly the same process all the way along, and then when you get to the end, you can add in your chosen closure. So I think this is the short side, so this is where I will add on my piece of chain. So I've got some split ring pliers. And you just get the little end in and open. Pop that on the end of your chain. You do occasionally get, with some of the beautiful Jessie James Beads chain reactions, you'll get larger split rings as well. They're very useful to hang on to. So my eyes are not what they once were. Let's just hold that in position, and then we'll pop the link over the end of that split ring. And then it's just a case of rotating that around. Whoops-a-daisy. And then at the other end, you'll be able to add in your clasp, and you'll end up with something like this. So let's just scooch this all out of the way for now. I will make a second one in just a moment with the pieces we've made today, but this is what you'll be looking at, and I'll show you the end here. So I've got my connector into a lobster clasp, and then I've got a length of extender chain. Now I had one spare station from this beautiful enamel chain, so I used that as a dropper. It also enhances the experience when you're trying to put jewellery on yourself, just to have something to grip onto whilst you put the chain in the correct position. But all of those little charms add on in the same way. They sit on the chain, not into the links of the chain. And there's your charm bracelet featuring Coquette Soirée. Now, if you wanted a little additional project, I appreciate these are very, very long earrings. You can cut your chain much shorter if you prefer. But what we're going to do is add a little extender drop down at the bottom. So I have a scrap length of that same 20 gauge wire. I'm going to ensure that that end is cut flush. And then I'm going to create a triple spiral on the end, exactly the same way as we did with those pearl charm drops. Bring that all the way around before switching back to your favourite flat facing pliers. So the slower you move with spirals, the neater and happier you will be. So that's 2 rotations. You can obviously just stop at 2 if you prefer, but I think 3 rotations of wire in that 20 gauge really balances nicely with the size of the beads we're working with. So let's bring that wire away. And again, when I'm making earrings, I like to have the spirals opposing each other. So we have one spiral moving clockwise, this one moving anti-clockwise. So let's grab one of those larger pearls and draw it down the central wire. And then one of the smaller ones. And these are very, very thrifty designs to make. We'll bring that wire forwards and then use the small side of those memory wire finishing pliers just to create a small loop up at the top, and it's a simple loop. So trim your wire, creating the flush cut on the remaining piece, and then make sure that that sits very neatly centrally at the top of that little mini stack, and then you can add that onto your length of chain. As I said, it doesn't have to be as long as the pieces I've got. I just happen to really like long dangly earrings. So up at the top, we're just going to add in a simple earring finding. So this already has the loop ready, making sure that your chain hangs in such a way that your spirals oppose each other so that you have that opposite symmetry, as it were, or a mirror finish. There we go, that looks right. And then we'll pop that into the loop. And then just close that up with your favourite fine tipped pliers. So you've got a pair of earrings there. You could make multiple sets. You could cut this down in size. You could even hang 2 unequal lengths of that beautiful enamel chain for very, very simplistic earrings. But there's your Coquette Soirée charm bracelet and earring set. Thank you for joining us here at Jessie James Beads. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.